Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed the segment with Peter Wallace, and in fact, I hope you enjoyed both segments on campaign finance reform. Perhaps if we're lucky, we'll get Peter back one day to talk about the debt and the restructuring and the causes of the Great Recession. Certainly he's an expert in that arena as well. But I think Peter's interview has done a really good job of educating you on some of the issues and hopefully on some of the solutions. I think that campaign finance reform, again, is an area that everybody's very concerned about, but we haven't been finding many solutions. And in fact, we've been going the wrong way. In my perspective, the Supreme Court and other courts are so tilted toward the free speech aspect of all this that I think we've lost all balance. We've lost all perspective. We've got to find a way to regain that, particularly in light of Citizens United and the Speech Now case. In terms of Peter's presentation, one of the things I really liked about his book is, again, the fact that he's thinking outside the box here. And his approach, I think, is very unusual in comparison to what most people would think are the solution sets. Most people want to limit money and find ways to just take this whole campaign disclosure thing and wrap it up and real tightly and just limit it. I think Peter has an interesting approach, and his partner, they have an interesting approach where they're basically saying, open it up a little more, and as you open it up a little more, that will drive competition. And I think, again, if we have competition and we have that balance, then we will probably not feel that we have this campaign finance problems to the extent, certainly to the extent that we do now. So thank you, Peter. And in thinking about campaign finance reform, I was looking for a link because campaign finance reform is a problem, but it seemed to be unrelated to this dysfunction and polarization we're talking about. It messes up the system, but may not necessarily be an underlying cause of dysfunction and polarization. So having said that, I was reading an interesting series of articles in the New York Times on one-party rule, and I would suggest to you that if you want to get online and read this series, it's an excellent series, and it drills down and it's starting to examine the causes of significant one-party rule and then the implications of significant one-party rule. And in one of the recent articles that I had read, there's a link there between this excessive campaign finance reform and polarization. Again, one of the ways that polarization presents itself is when one party controls all of the legislature and all of the executive branch in a particular jurisdiction. We talked about that in one of our shows, the ways you can have variations on a theme, but clearly when the executive branch and the legislature is controlled by one party, you have one-party rule, you have implications for polarization that are not positive and usually don't play out well. And I think we've seen a lot of that in some of the decisions that are coming out, particularly at the state level, where they're dominated by one party. So what the New York Times did is they linked the explosion of campaign finance reform, Citizens United, Speech Now, and the use of the not-for-profit status to high disclosure to open up statewide campaigns to the national level. And they walk you through how various states are now attracting money from all over the country and how this money is being funneled through multiple sources, multiple steps, very intricate webs, very intricate patterns of how this money is ending up directed to a particular state. And the goal of this money is to create single rule, single party, single organization, domination and control of states. The scary part is that right now, this article explains, we are at the high water mark for single party rule, at least for the last 60 years. So in the last 60 years, this is the highest and the most we've had of a single-party rule at the state level. And here's the breakdown. Let's look at the board. There are 23 states that are singularly controlled by Republicans. There are 13 states that are singularly controlled by Democrats. And there's only 13 states where we have mixed government. Again, the executive may be different than the legislature, or the two houses of the legislature may be different from each other. Nebraska is an interesting exception, because in Nebraska they have a nonpartisan legislature and it's unicameral, so they don't really fit that dynamic. Although my suspicion is Nebraska has been heavily dominated by the Republican Party. But when you have this much single-party domination, we have 36 states now with single-party domination, you get a distortion in legislation and you get a distortion in government. And what we're going to start talking about on our next show is how this distortion then plays out in redistricting and another layer of incumbency protection. So I recommend to you the New York Times series, and I recommend to you to start thinking about the link between campaign finance reform and polarization.